Welcome everyone to this is number 2 in our series. We did one last week on seed gathering, so we're delighted to have Andy Robinson here with us this evening. I'm from Woodland Croft, talking us through nursery techniques. I'm just going to set the scene for Fife. Apologies for anyone that's out with Fife. This obviously was advertised for Fife, so I'm sure some of you'll get something out of this evening because nursery techniques will be applicable in other areas, but I will set a little bit of context for Fife first of all. So my name is Rebecca Logston. I'm the Community Tree Planting Officer with the Climate Action Fife project, which is this awesome project which has 12 different partners across Fife working together to try and encourage everyone to be more climate friendly, whether that's their business, in their gardens, the way that they grow or use food, the way they travel or holidays. So just tracking everything that we're doing in Fife. And my role is to lead on community tree planting and the natural environmental enhancement. So we've got big ambitions in Fife around community planting. There's lots of benefits for tree planting, thinking around tackling flooding, biodiversity and health and recreation sort of benefits to us as people. So we're looking to plant this big ambition of 1 tree per person at least in our communities. So why grow trees? So part of that is to actually realise that community ambition that we've got, to realise all those benefits. A lot of it is around climate resilience and about having the species that we think will survive with some of the climate modelling that we're looking at, and how that will affect different trees in the future. So the more biodiverse, the more types of trees we've got, hopefully the more climate resilient we will be. And we want to increase some of our rare native species that we have in Fife as well. So there might be particular trees that we're looking to grow. If we can gather our own seed from Fife, then we can be assured that it's local provenance, and then hopefully it's going to thrive better as well, rather than buying it in from other nurseries from other areas. So that local seed gathering and growing really helps trees to thrive because they're acclimatized to that particular zone and that area. Hopefully that also means they'll be less resistant to things like pests and diseases. We are seeing some impacts, obviously, on our trees with pests and diseases, and so that might garner our ambitions and around tree growing and propagation. So we're already seeing stock availability issues with some nurseries being out of stock before the end of the tree planting season. So yeah, if we can grow as a community and we can grow community trees, that helps us not only with being able to just source those trees, but also to bring down those costs as well, because we're gathering the seed and the cost is in our time in terms of looking after trees and growing them. So what trees for Fife? The majority of our community tree planting is supported by the Woodland Trust, which is awesome, through free tree packs. So there's a lot of different species there that we get, and they're usually quite small whip trees, size of trees. So it'd be great to grow on in our nurseries as well, our community nurseries, so our trees are a little bit bigger and maybe will thrive more. We can be looking at a mixture between native and naturalised trees and non-natives as well. So in all the modelling around climate, they suggest native is great, keep it biodiverse. We want to enhance biodiversity, but there is also suggestions there about the role of non-natives and naturalised trees in that mix as well. When you're thinking about which trees to grow, think also about the different levels in a woodland structure, from shrubs to sub-canopy and canopy levels, so that we have that real mixture of different things. So in the pictures there, we've got the Gelder Rose and the Wayfaring tree, which are sort of smaller shrub trees, and then we've got up to aspen and field maple and lime and black poplar there, going up into the sort of sub-canopy and canopy levels. So yeah, think about that kind of structure if you can when you're growing in your nursery, about providing kind of different types of trees and different functions in a woodland. We kind of recommend not to grow as many things of these trees on this list. So horse chestnuts and beech mainly because of it's a difficult one to plant in a woodland setting. It's also quite a big tree to put in an urban setting, as is the same with horse chestnuts. It's quite difficult to find space for these trees. They're beautiful, but we don't need as many of them. And some of the other trees I've listed there, like the sycamore and the silver birch, it's not to say don't grow them, but these are trees that will propagate very easily if there's a seed stock locally, and so they don't necessarily need a helping hand at the moment. So in Fife, we've got a tree planting palette that was developed by St Andrew's Botanic Gardens, and this is something that's actually going to be updated because the modelling and the science about tree species is continually changing along with that climate modelling. And we've got the different trees that are recommended for the different habitats that we might have, like rural, dry or wet, urban, dry or wet, and there's also a hedging one as well. And it talks about the different levels of the canopy types as well. And gives you a proportion of the trees that you might be looking to source for that kind of planting scale. So this is a really useful resource to try and give you a sense of what kind of trees we might be looking to grow for communities in Fife. And just to give you something to inspire you, we've got a gentleman here, Colin Andrews, who's been doing a fantastic job. He's been collecting, I think he collected 200 oak acorns to grow oaks, and he's grown them on, and he's creating this forest, a kin forest across Fife of planting these 200 oaks with community groups and community spaces. So there's lots of, we've got our 5 tree wardens, which I'll talk about in a bit, who are also looking to collect tree seed and grow trees from seeds. So we've got lots of interest in growing in Fife, which is fantastic. Last week we covered tree seed gathering. There were some lovely resources here that we highlighted, and as a follow-up from this evening, we'll send you a list of different links that will be of use. So last week we looked at seed gathering, different tree species across the year that you might want to collect, how you might want to store them and pre-treat them. So this evening session, we've got Andy Robinson from Woodland Crofters, who's had over 20 years of experience of growing trees and 3 years commercially in a nursery setting. So Andy, if you want to start booting up your slides, I'll just set up what you're going to be covering in this next session. So looking at growing methods, containers and compost, sowing, you're going to go through a species focus, look at things beyond just year 1, pests and diseases and hardening off. So this is what we're going to be covering this evening. So I'll now hand over to Andy. And I'll stop showing my slides so that you can share yours.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. That's great. I'm going to start showing my screen now, so you don't have to look at me for too long. And Rebecca, if you can just give me some feedback if you can't hear me, or...
Yeah. I can hear you great. Yeah.
You can hear me great. Okay, let's try sharing screen. And let me know when you can see the first slide, Rebecca.
It's just coming up. That's wonderful, lovely picture of an oak. Great.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I don't know how many of you were with us last week, but there's a bit of overlap to what I talked about last week. But as Rebecca said, last week I looked at seed collection and a bit of processing and storage, and this week I'm going to focus more on of the croft, which was a Sitka spruce plantation 10 years ago, and that was all felled, and I got the tenancy on the croft. It's a community owned croft, and I'm a tenant. I got the tenancy about 10 years ago and put the first of those polytunnels up 3 years ago, and the second one went up just this year. Yeah. And just to get a closer overview of that, so you can see what I'm doing. At the top there, you've got the 2 polytunnels. One of them, the lower one, the larger one, is primarily for growing cell-grown trees in root trainers. And the smaller one is primarily for a workspace and propagation, so for seed trays and potting things up, and things like that. And then below in the garden area, I've got some trees grown in open beds. So I grow sort of about 2,500, 3,000 trees in there, mainly hazel and oak, but a few other smaller numbers of birch, rowan, hawthorn, blackthorn. I'm mostly growing the species that are native to Mull. That's what my market is for these new woodland creations or restocking of felled plantations. The plantations that were predominantly Sitka and larch that are now being felled are thankfully they're restocking them with a lot greater percentage of native broadleaves. So that's nice to see. The last order I've supplied was for 9,500 trees, literally going right next door to the croft. So it couldn't be any more local, really. It's all the seeds collecting on the island, and then a lot of it's been planted within a few hundred meters of the croft. I don't expect that market to last forever, so I'll be supplying trees all over the island, but I would imagine most of my trees will stay on mull for the next few years, and I don't have to worry too much about transport costs. And then on the right of the fenced garden area, I've got trees that are hardening off. This photo was just taken late August, I think. So the trees spend the first few months, March till midsummer, depending, and then they go out to harden off for the last few months of the year. So that's the polytunnel. That was a couple of years ago. That's me with my hands in my pockets, as usual. The shade netting, you can see there, I learned after the first year in the polytunnel that shade netting is absolutely crucial. The young leaves of the trees can get very badly scorched very quickly. So the shade netting really helps, especially when the trees are very small. That's just looking from the other end. Got a lot of hazel on the right there. It's mainly hazel and oak there, with the smaller trees there, probably birch and alder with a few other bits and bobs. I've got a sort of a seed tray area there at the back on the left-hand side with a little irrigation system over that. I have got overhead irrigation now, so that makes watering the whole tunnel a lot easier. And this is in the garden beds where I've got hazel on the right and on the left and oak in the middle. In practice, I grow for 2 years in the open ground and sell them as bare root trees, but they do need to be lifted and root pruned and then lined out again, planted again in rows for the second season. Oak especially will send down a very strong taproot, and if you leave it in the bed for 2 years, you will have trouble digging it up, as I found to my cost. In fact, that section of oak in the middle there, I think that must have been their second year growing, and I thought I could undercut the taproots with a sharp spade and leave them in situ for 2 growing seasons. But that didn't work very well, and I had massive taproots on them. They survived fine, but it just makes them difficult to lift, and the tree planters won't thank you very much for having a tree with a massive taproot on it to try and plant it. In commercial nurseries, I've never seen this in action, but they have a machine that will pass a blade underneath the bed and cut the taproots while they're still growing. And you can see behind there, I've got vole-proof boxes for oak and hazel, and they start their life with those boards around them and with vole rodent-proof mesh over the top. I'll go into a bit more detail about those as we go along. So yeah, that's the garden. That's not the best picture, but that's a bit later on in the season, I think. Oak and hazel again. The larger seeded species, if you like oak and hazel, if you can keep the rodents off them, I find pretty easy to grow outside. In terms of watering, they don't need to be constantly irrigated like the small seed would, like birch and alder, rowan, and they're not so prone to weed competition. So the hazel, you can see there on either side of the oak beds, they were lined out in rows 6 inches apart, and I could then pass a hoe in between them and hoe them until the leaf cover shaded out the weeds, and that, you know, you've got canopy cover covering the bare ground, so weeds aren't such a problem. So most of my cell grown stock I grow in root trainers. Most of you, or some of you, will be familiar with these. They're handy for all kinds of growing and gardening. So yeah, I will make up the books of root trainers. They come flat packed and the trays come separately in boxes, and then you make them up into a tray like that and fill with compost. Oak, acorns and hazel I will sow directly as they sprout into these, and the smaller seeds, birch, alder, rowan, hawthorn, will be either sown in seed trays and then pricked out, or the hawthorn and the blackthorn I do sow directly as they sprout as well, but that's a bit fiddlier, being a bit more of a smaller seed. So root trainers are great because they train the roots, as the name suggests, down towards a gap in the bottom, and then they're air pruned, so the roots hit the air and they die off, and then that forces lateral root growth further up the roots, and so you get a nice plug of roots. And in practice, you can grow trees for 2 seasons, or probably more, up to probably about 50 centimeters. Any more than that's getting a bit silly, but I've grown them up to about 50 centimeters, as long as there's sufficient nutrition in the growing medium. I use a slow release Osmocote pellet, which is pretty standard. I use that as at the lowest dosage concentration, if you like, which is 5 or 6 grams per litre. So I'll mix a big batch of peat-free compost and then mix the Osmocote in, and then add it to the cells. These are willow cuttings, actually. I don't grow many things from cuttings, but you can see these did really well in the root trainers. These are bird cherry, in their 2nd year of growth there. So they're ready to go out, to be sold, to be planted. Typically for forestry, minimum size is 15 centimeters, ideally 20 centimeters. I grade my trees 15 to 30 centimeters, and then 30 to 50 centimeters, and at a different price for those different sizes. And 15 centimeters sounds very small, but if it's got a sufficient stem diameter and it's got a good root structure, and there's not too much competition from weeds, most planting sites, the ground will be prepared either by mounding or hand scraping the turf off the planting area. Herbicides I use sometimes. I wouldn't do that myself, but we do use glyphosate sometimes to weed around the trees. This is another type of cell that I use. These are called PropTech trays. They're quite new to the industry. They've got a lot of benefits. You don't have to make them up like the root trainers, which is quite fiddly and time consuming. They're a lot more durable. I'm hoping these will last quite a few years, because they are significantly more expensive. You can stack them either way, so if you span that 180 degrees, it would slot into the other one, so they're great for storage like that. And then when you stack them with a gap between them, you can actually move around plants when they're a few centimeters tall, so that's very handy. In a bigger nursery, they'll move these around with forklifts. I don't have a forklift. I'm not quite at that scale yet. So here's some oak growing in the PropTech trays. This is quite a good demonstration of 2 different types of compost. You can see the ones on the right are significantly bigger. They were both sown at the same time. They were both peat-free composts. The one I'm using at the moment is a coir-based compost. I know there are advantages and disadvantages to using coir. For the moment, it works very well for me, and in the absence of peat, I think it's what a lot of people are going to end up using. The other one is more of a wood-based compost, and it tended to dry out very easily on the top, and I think that really held them back. These were sown in the autumn and then stored in the polytunnel over the winter. Yeah, and obviously rodents are a problem. So I would say my biggest pest and problem, once the deer and the rabbits are fenced out, is mice and voles, especially for acorns and hazelnuts. But my experience is once they're up and away and they're growing, they're reasonably safe, and the rodents aren't too interested in them. I'll have a few thousand oak and hazel in the polytunnel in early summer, and I have traps set, but thankfully catch very few mice and voles in the traps. So they're just, yeah, more of a problem over the winter. These are air pots, which some of you might be familiar with. These are actually produced in Scotland in Midlothian by a company called the Caledonian Tree Company, and they are fantastic for growing larger trees. You can leave them in the air pots for a long time, and they won't get root bound because the roots reach the holes in the outside and in the bottom, and will be air pruned. So you end up with a fantastic bushy mass of roots. I've got some photos later on of some aspen trees grown in air pots. They use these in places like Kew for very big plants, and effectively you can make them as big as you want. You can buy a roll of the black knobbly stuff and cut it to size and make absolutely huge air pots if you really want. I'm thinking of trying to do citrus trees in them actually in the polytunnel, and see how that works. Yeah, and you can use them for growing vegetables as well. As I say, they are quite expensive, but I think they look quite cool. A lot of people won't like them, but I think they look good. Can you still hear me, Rebecca?
Yeah, all good, Andy.
Okay, good. I was just making sure you haven't all disappeared and I'd be half an hour talking to myself. Yeah, air pots. So yeah, another example of root pruning. But effectively, you can grow trees in pretty much anything. For years, I was just growing in fish boxes. There's some hazelnuts there that was sown in fish boxes in the spring. Hazel I collect at this time of year and store over the winter in sharp sand or in compost, and then I'll start going through the seeds in March and sow them once they've sprouted. But you could put hazelnuts in a fish box or in a big container in the autumn, and as long as you are keeping them safe from voles again, they would start to grow in the spring. These are haddock pots, plastic pots, which aren't that great for the environment, I know, but they're very cheap. And for growing slightly larger trees, I've got a white beam and a rowan. I can't really see what the one is. It might be an elm in the middle. Quite good for selling slightly larger trees to local people in smaller quantities. People will often prefer to buy a slightly larger tree for the garden, although in my experience of planting a smaller tree will invariably catch up with a larger tree quite quickly, and as long as you can protect it from grazing, not too much of a problem to plant a smaller tree. But yeah, these are good little pots, quite cheap. They do a biodegradable version now, which I've started to use. It's a sort of a light beige colour, and I found that they hold up pretty well after a couple of years outside. They don't seem to be biodegrading yet, so hopefully they will biodegrade. You can see there the roots coming out of the bottom, which isn't so great. I think that was a round tree which was only potted at the beginning of this season, so I would be looking to put that in a bigger pot or plant it out somewhere now. And various sheep lick buckets, which we have an endless supply of here. Quite often any trees that are growing in root trainers that are too small to be sold at the end of the season, if I've got a few dozen, I'll just stick them in these lick buckets with a few holes in the bottom and leave them around the back of the polytunnel and forget about them, and then pick out the better trees at the end of the year. And it's kind of the survival of the fittest, mainly because I don't like throwing anything away. I don't really like throwing reject trees away, but sometimes you've got to be quite ruthless, I think. Otherwise you'll end up completely swamped with trees, as I have found. Just got trees in various containers everywhere. These are Monterey pine, I think. This was from a few years ago. These are those little yogurt pots that you get those, yeah, the larger yogurt pots, and you peel the paper off them, and they make pretty good tree pots. You can grow trees for at least for a season, if not two, using these. I pierce holes in the bottom of them using a soldering iron. I find that really works really well, rather than trying to drill them or puncture it and then they just crack. A hot soldering iron, obviously, you can just, it doesn't smell very nice, so you can probably do it outside, but yeah, just make lots of holes in the bottom. Acorns, this was probably a couple of years ago. This time of year, we've got lots of acorns this year, thankfully. It wasn't such a great year last year. So I collect a few thousand acorns every year, and a lot of them I will sow directly into root trainers as they sprout in the autumn, or I will sow them into beds in the garden. I might not do that again this year. We'll see how many acorns I've got. So I'll sow them in 2 bands, but you could just broadcast over the whole area. These boards are dug a few inches into the ground to stop voles and rodents tunneling in. I have found in previous years that if we get a heavy frost and it loosens the ground around these beds, the voles will get in. So you have to be aware of that. So once they're sown and they're covered, do about
Andy,
100.
can I? Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just going to say the picture's a bit out of sync. So we've still got the picture of the yogurt pots.
Oh, okay. I'll try.
Oh, there we go.
Back.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so we've got the vole-proof one. That's it.
Okay.
Lovely. Thank you.
You've got the acorns in the.
Yeah. Got that
Okay,
one
so now hopefully what I'm saying now makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I think they're just a little bit slower to come through, but yeah. Cheers, Andy.
Okay, I'll let them catch up a bit as I go. So yeah, once they're sown, I'll cover those over with compost, and then the rodent mesh goes over the top. This is a 6mm mesh. Can you see that, Rebecca?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so yeah, that's covered with the rodent mesh, the 6mm rodent mesh. You can buy this online fairly easily. They did used to stock it in Homebase, and they called it snake and rodent mesh. No problem with snakes here, but yeah, presumably for people at home trying to keep their snakes in. And that was the cheapest place I found it, actually. I don't know whether they still do it. And that's in a 900mm wide roll, and usually 5 meters long, I think. So that's great. You know, you can make all sorts of boxes with this mesh, and it works keeping the rodents out. And then that's the following summer, and as the oaks reach the top, I'll take the rodent mesh off, by which time I hope they're not too vulnerable to rodents. And I can easily weed in between these rows of these bands of acorns. But in practice, as I say, you could just broadcast them evenly across the whole bed. You can make a much smaller version of this if you like. It doesn't have to be this big. And onto compost. This is the compost I'm using. This is the Sinclair peat-free compost, which I get in it's a 2 cubic meter bag, and by the time I get it to mold, it's quite expensive. It's worth experimenting with different composts. I find the peat-free composts you get in the garden centres pretty rubbish, to be honest. They usually need sieving, and they're very, very variable. I have thought about making my own compost, and I do make my own compost for the garden and for growing vegetables, but I can't really make enough in sufficient quantities for the tree growing at the moment. This Sinclair peat-free provides a nice even consistency. I get it without any fertilizer added to it, and so I need to add anything I need to grow the trees. As I say, I use this slow release Osmocote first foot fertilizer, which you can buy in big bags or in small packets. And I know that has its disadvantages as well environmentally. I've done some trials with biochar, which haven't been that successful. I haven't been able to do a very scientific trial. Unfortunately, the biochar trees are on the right and the Osmocote trees are on the left. They did quite well in the first season, but in the second season, they were really struggling. So I would have to give them an additional liquid feed or a top dressing. I think there's a lot of work to be done here for people to establish techniques to grow without these fertilizers. Growing a tree, what is effectively quite a large plant in a very small cell of growing media is quite difficult without constantly feeding them with liquid feeds, in my experience. And most, if not all, nurseries use the slow release fertilizers. Even people like Trees for Life, who you might expect to be more environmentally friendly. But I think that the benefits outweigh the downsides. You know, that the end product is worth it. Is worth the compromise you're making here. Pricking out on the right there's a tray of birch. I will typically sow birch and alder in mid-March in the polytunnel at a lower density than I used to. I think I'm sowing at about 4 grams of seed for one of those seed trays. In previous years, I've really oversown and I've ended up with about 600 trees in one of those standard seed trays, which is way too dense and they're way too small. I'm aiming to get maybe 200, 250 larger trees out of a seed tray. This is a pretty good size to prick out. They've got their true leaves, they've got a decent root system, and they can be pricked out into pots or into root trainers. I typically use a screwdriver, but anything sharp and pointy is good enough, I think. These are wych elm, which I collect in early June and sow immediately, and after a few weeks you get seedlings big enough to prick out. It's a nice, quick, satisfying crop to grow wych elms from seed to seedling. These are wych elm in the cells after a few weeks in the cells. A bit of sunshine. I call this one sunshine on leaf for all you Proclaimers fans. Blackthorn, a close-up of the blackthorn seed there. Blackthorn and hawthorn I'm collecting at this time of year and cleaning as much of the flesh off as possible, and then either putting in buckets and leaving outside mixed with sand and compost for at least one winter. In the case of hawthorn, probably 2 winters. So the seed I collect now will not be sown until 2025, which seems a bit frightening that it's 2025 around the corner. Blackthorn is usually ready to sow in the following spring. I sometimes put it in the fridge as a pre-treatment mixed with a substrate of sand and compost, but I find it germinates pretty well after just sitting outside in a bucket in the elements. So as the seed is germinating in the spring, I start to check the seeds from late February, early March, and as they start to sprout, they'll start to sprout in the fridge. I'll sow them either in a seed tray, or I'll sow them directly into growing containers, either smaller modules or root trainers. If you want an easy life, you can just sow them straight in a seed tray and wait for them to come up and then prick them out. That's probably the best way to do it if you're just doing a few dozen or a few hundred. These are birch and alder, germinating. This probably would have been late March, early April. With these smaller seeds, it's essential to keep them very well watered while they're germinating, watering them every day. yeah, I sow them onto a mix of compost and either perlite or vermiculite, so it's a nice free draining mix. Maybe about a quarter of the mix is perlite or vermiculite, and then I'll cover the whole seed tray with vermiculite to retain moisture. And sometimes I'll put a sheet of plastic over the top until they germinate, just to retain the moisture. Hazel, the one on the left is an ideal time to pot up your hazel. The one on the right is a bit far gone. You can see it's got a very long root on it and a very long shoot, so you run more risk of damaging this as you're potting it up. Somewhere in between is fine, but this spring I just didn't have time to get to all the thousands of hazelnuts I had, and a lot of them ended up being potted up very late, and most of them were okay. More than anything, it's just easier to pot them up with a smaller radical, smaller root shoot on them. So I'll start to go through them, put them in a sieve, and pick out all the ones that have sprouted. From about early March, I'll start checking them. Typically, they don't really start to sprout until late March, early April, depending on temperatures, of course. And that's then potted straight into the root trainer and about 1 inch deep, and then covered in compost. And these are, I'll just zoom in a bit for you. These are oak, and I think these were probably potted up about February. What I'll do with acorns now, I will keep them moist in a shed, obviously protected from rodents again. Keep spraying them with water to stop them wrinkling and drying out, and keep turning them so that they're not going mouldy. And then once I've got a significant number sprouting, I'll pop them directly into root trainers or pots. I did used to just pop them all, and you do get a pretty reasonable success rate. You'll get maybe 75–80% of them coming up, but I found doing it like this, I get closer to 95% of trees growing in cells. A bit more work, obviously, because you do have to go through them and process them. What I did a couple of years ago, or I think these are from last year, a lot of the smaller acorns I just put into these module trays. These are very shallow modules, but it's enough compost to keep them alive over the winter, as long as you keep them somewhere safe, rodent free again. And they will start to sprout quite early on, and they will put on quite a bit of root over the winter. So although you're not seeing that top growth until the spring, they will be sending roots down. So keep them watered, keep an eye on them, and then I will use those to fill any gaps I've got in my bigger root trainers, and any leftover I'll pot on anyway. So yeah, it's quite a good way to keep them over the winter, especially if you haven't got space, or if you haven't got the pots available for them. Just put them into module trays. I found these on eBay. I think they were used for 1 season in the nursery, and they were very, very cheap on eBay. They're trays of 96 cells, I think, and they were pennies for each one. Just give them a good clean and a bleach when you get them for biosecurity reasons. So those are the little oaks when they're coming out of the modules to be potted on into something bigger. That's elm seed sown in a fish box last summer. I think I mentioned this last week. Elm seed, although it's often quite abundant, it's usually got quite a low viability because this seed has been eaten by a moth larvae. So a lot of the winged seed will be empty. So I find that I'll sow it quite thickly. These are sown about 1 inch thick and then covered in sharp sand. I didn't get a great germination rate on them this year. I only got maybe 100 or so, maybe 150 trees out of all those seeds, believe it or not. A little bit about aspen. I've got a little project to propagate aspen from different clones on the island. And I have done mist propagation by hand with softwood cuttings in the summer. I don't have a mist unit, which is what most people use. I don't have a mist unit yet, so I've got a method where I grow them for a couple of years in air pots, and then in the late winter I'll take them out of the air pots. You see there how bushy the roots get growing in an air pot, and I'll prune a small section of roots, anything over, you know, maybe 3 or 4 mil thick, and maybe take something about 20 or 30 mil long. Prune little sections of roots like that, and then put them into a seed tray. And then with the tree that you've pruned, you can either repot them to grow on, or I just potted those out on the croft and to grow on as trees on the croft. And then after a few weeks or a couple of months, you'll get the shoots coming off those little root sections. And I found that a nice low-tech, easy way to do aspen. It takes a bit longer, but yeah, you don't have to worry about mist units or getting seed, which is, well, it's pretty impossible to get seed where I live, because each clone is a single sex, and they aren't close enough to an opposite sex clone to seed, which is the problem through a lot of Scotland. Trees for Life are doing a lot of work on growing aspen from seed and creating seed orchards in their polytunnels, which is great. So that's them mid to late summer, and fantastic growth on some of those just tiny little root sections in those shallow seed trays. So I'll take those and pot them up over the winter and keep a sort of rotating stock of different clones of aspen trees. That makes sense. So from about early June, the trees in the polytunnel are getting big enough to harden off. So these ones probably could have gone outside a little bit sooner than this. Anything over 15 or 20 centimeters, I'd want to put them out to harden off. So I need to choose my window, weather window, if you like, so that I'm not putting them out in a howling gale or into baking hot sunshine, which isn't always that easy in this part of the world. There's some blackthorn going out to harden off. There's the first of about 5,000 hazel, which did absolutely fantastically this year, with some windbreak going around them. I put them on this reinforcing mesh, which they use for house foundations, which works really well, and that means there's an airspace underneath the root trainers, and they can continue to air prune. I find putting them on pallets is not great, because then they just sit on the wood, and then the roots will reach the end of the root trainers and then run along the wood, and yeah, you'll end up with all these big straggly roots hanging off the bottom of the root of the plugs of trees, which isn't ideal. So yeah, once they're outside, they need a lot of watering, and counterintuitively, I've found, especially when the weather's hot, they need more watering outside, because you're going to get more transpiration from dry winds. I had a hell of a job trying to keep things watered this year in that very hot spell. You get a hot day with a hot drying wind, and you can literally watch the trees wilt. Obviously, growing in those very small cells, the root trainers are only 175 cc's of compost. They will dry up very, very quickly. So I've got a solar powered pump in the burn below the croft, and that works without any battery or charge controller. And the more the sun shines, the more it pumps up to my tanks. I've got a 6,000 litre tank there and a 1,000 litre IBC tank. And this year I bought this pump, which has a hose that goes into the IBC tank and sucks the water out. And I get through about 1,000 litres a day using this, but it's been an absolute godsend. I wouldn't have been able to keep up with the watering this year. I was still spending about an hour a day watering. But yeah, when you put your trees out to harden off, it's worth protecting them, and if you've got a shady area, to put them for a week or so, more the better. Keep them out of the harsh sun, keep them out of the wind. Having said that, it's perfectly fine to grow your trees outside from the beginning. The reason I'm using a polytunnel is to get quick growth early on and get more trees to a saleable size within one growing season. You actually end up with probably a better, hardier tree growing outside for the whole season, to be honest. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with that at all. A few pests and diseases. Powdery mildew looks awful on the oaks. Affects the oaks outside more than it does in the polytunnel. It doesn't kill them. It starts to slow their growth down from about mid-July usually. Some years are worse than others. Watering is crucial, really. The better hydrated you can keep the roots, the less prone trees are to powdery mildew. The most susceptible trees are oak, hawthorn, dog rose, to a certain extent rowan. They all get affected by a different host-specific powdery mildew. I think hawthorns for me are the ones that are worst affected by the powdery mildew. Oaks seem pretty bulletproof. It just slows them down a bit. I don't use any fungicides at all. I know some nurseries will use a fungicide for this kind of thing. I'm told that spraying with a milk solution can work. I've not tried it, but there are a few organic or non-chemical treatments to try. These were chafer beetles, which haven't been a significant problem, but they seem to go for the hazel trees, and you'll get a little patch of them eating away the leaves. Something to watch out for. More of a problem kind of mid-summer. One of the worst things is vine weevil, which a lot of you gardeners are probably familiar with. They will establish themselves in pots and containers, and they can eat away at the roots of the plant. And you see these round trees look perfectly healthy above ground, and then you give them a tug and there's no roots left on them. Zoom in a little there. So some nurseries can lose a lot of stock to vine weevil, not to be confused with pine weevil, which is another forestry problem, but not so much of a problem in the nursery. So yeah, the grubs eat the roots. I use a nematode twice a year. This pack I've got will treat 100 square meters. You can get them in smaller packs, I think. And I will do that in the spring, and I'm about to due to do that again. I'll do it again in October, just to give them a bit of protection for any overwintering weevil. Yeah, I don't know whether it works, but I'm not prepared to take the risk to see if it doesn't work, if that makes sense. It costs me about 50 quid, 60 quid to do twice a year for the whole nursery, so it's not a huge expense. Hail damage, not something we get very often, but there's some nice white beam trees which were just absolutely hammered by hail last summer. Just a very quick, heavy hailstorm. Basically, there's all sorts of things which can kill your trees and eat them or damage them, and it's a constant battle in my experience, trying to keep the things alive. But hopefully, it'll get easier as the years go on, and I get more aware of these things. But I'm sure every year will throw up its own challenges. And they are the trees bagged up, ready to go out. Yeah, that was last autumn. There's a few hundred hazel trees going to one of the community woodland plantings. I use these. They're not as big as they look. They're not like the big bags you get from the builder's merchant for sand. These are a bit smaller, and I can get about 150 trees in each one. And I think we're getting towards the end. Some of you might have looked at this already. There's a Facebook group I set up last year, which now has 480 members, I think, and that's for anybody who's got an interest in growing trees, whether it's a few trees in pots, or you're growing 50 or 100,000 trees, you know, you can come on here and ask any question about anything, and it's been a great resource. And I set it up really for myself because I had so many questions when I set up doing trees more commercially, from more of a hobby angle. I had so many questions, and this has been fantastic to network with other people. There's nurseries all over the country, quite a lot on the west coast of Scotland. That's probably our core membership as far as nurseries go, and quite a few down in England and Wales. I don't know whether we've got any international ones yet, and I don't know how transferable our techniques are, but yeah, it's worth looking at. So come and join. You'd be more than welcome. That's my own Woodland Crofter Facebook page where I update what I'm doing there, tree growing and other croft things. And that's the Mole Aspen project, which is my side project specifically for aspen, which I don't have enough time to dedicate to, unfortunately. But yeah, and that's about it, Rebecca, I think.
Great, thanks, Andy. Wonderful stuff. Lots and lots of information
Okay.
there. So
I'll just sharing my screen now.
That's great. Yeah, I've got a few slides to show at the end, but we've got a time for now for a little bit of question and answer time. So if you want to, we are still recording, but if you want to come on the camera and ask a question, that's absolutely fine. Or if you'd like to put something in the chat box, I can read that out. So either way, while we're waiting for questions to come forward, I just wanted to ask you about tap roots there, Andy. So you mentioned I've got some trees in the nursery, oaks that have been in our nursery for quite a while. So I'm thinking they're going to be long tap roots there. So yeah. I mean, does it damage the tree to cut the tap root?
Have they been in the ground?
Yeah, they've been in beds for a couple of years, I think.
A couple of years. Yeah, I mean, as long as you're digging them up in the winter, you should be okay. Yeah. I mean, I've cut tap roots that are, you know, about 12 inches long in half, and you'll find probably they won't have too many fibrous lateral roots on them, so it's not ideal. I mean, I think in the big nurseries, if they're cutting the tap root regularly, it'll stimulate lateral bushy root growth. So yeah. Okay. But yeah, you should get away with it.
Okay, we'll give it a shot. Shot. Looks like I've got a bit of a digging project to go then.
Yeah, they just might be quite difficult to dig up with anything.
Yeah, I was like thinking, oh, fantastic, we've got some quite strong trees here, but obviously they haven't been root pruned, and yeah, they've been left in the bed. Ian, do you have anything, questions that you wanted to ask? You've come on, so yeah, go for it, Ian. You're on mute, sorry.